This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, 1977, a judge by the name of Alexander A. Lawrence filed a 75-page opinion which determined that the U.S. government was at fault in the explosion at the Thiokol Chemical Corporation plant. This was part of a long legal battle in the wake of the disaster at the Thiokol plant near the town of Woodbine, Georgia, which is southern Georgia, pretty close to the Florida border. The plant was manufacturing trip flare devices that were being used in the Vietnam War. And in February 1971, a fire at that plant got out of control, leading to a massive explosion, dozens of workers killed and injured, a fire that burned 200 acres of forest and, of course, had a huge impact on local residents. The explosion at Thiokol and the aftermath is the subject of a new short documentary on PBS called The Day That Shook Georgia. It is from Patrick Longstreth, who joins us now as special guest. Patrick, congrats on the documentary, and thank you for telling this story. Super fascinating.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah, and here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
So, Patrick, I know the doc is called The Day That Shook Georgia, but as you chronicle, this had implications far beyond Georgia. I mean, like, this story is tied to the Vietnam War, to health and safety standards around the country. It features Jimmy Carter, who was then governor, but would, of course, become president. We'll get to all that bigger context, but I want to start with the plant itself. Can you tell us a little bit about Thiokol, and also what are trip flares? What's this thing that they're manufacturing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so this whole thing happened in rural southeast Georgia, and in 1965, Thiokol came to the area because it was pretty remote, and they were able to find cheap labor. And they needed it to be remote because they were actually building rockets for NASA for the space race. And at some point in the 60s, they actually tested the largest rocket in history at that time in Woodbine, Georgia. But then NASA decided to switch to solid fuel rockets. NASA switched to liquid fuel from solid fuel. And they were looking for a new contract because they had all this infrastructure built and labor. And they ended up getting a contract for making trip flares for the Vietnam War. And trip flares are basically like a road flare that you've seen on the highway, except much bigger. And it shoots up a giant flame that signals to, it's either a distress signal or it just lights up a whole area if you need it lit, or they can set them as like booby traps for the enemy. So they were very useful devices for the Vietnam War. You know, troops really depended on them. And Thiokol became the main manufacturers of these trip flares, and they hired mostly black women to manufacture these because black women were the most available job resource in the area, and they wanted women in particular because manufacturing these flares required a lot of dexterity and speed. So they actually hired a lot of young black women, and it was a great opportunity for them at the time. In rural southeast Georgia, there was still a lot of segregation, and most of them, the only jobs they could get was domestic work or agriculture. So this was a great thing. Everyone was very excited for Thiokol. They were employing 600 people at one point. And then the downside, obviously, was the Army didn't give them proper instructions for handling these materials. So they thought they were working with flammable materials, but they were actually working with highly explosive materials.
It's fascinating because it is this small town, right? It's a story that I don't think many people have heard of, but it contains all of the complexities of the United States in the mid-20th century. Here's Thiokol, which is both right in the center of the military-industrial complex, but also the space race. And so, has that exploratory vibe, but then also has this really violent vibe. You have the exploitation of Black women workers, which is something you also hear from stories like Hidden Figures, right? The role of Black women in shaping the course of the United States and doing the labor of the space age and the atomic age, but also being at risk and being, segregated and all of these different things. And it's fascinating to find a story that captures so much of that really big picture stuff.
And it's also something that I think people are not readily aware of. I think oftentimes we know of the Challenger, we know of these sort of big explosions that, sort of get imprinted on our memory. But I think this is a story that has also been largely forgotten or buried in terms of the national public memory.
Yeah, I should jump in and mention something because this is a little bit of a spoiler. So if your audience wants to close their ears, but mentioning the Challenger, Thiokol is the company that went on to make the rockets for the Challenger.
Yeah, and a lot of the sort of safety protocols or safety gaps were sort of revealed in future stories and responses, right?
Right. And then it's surprising, but then it's to think that a company could have a disaster like this on their record and then continue to be a government contractor. But if you look at there's history, there's many examples of government contractors that just keep on getting big contracts after safety problems. So you guys mentioned the Port Chicago disaster in one of your podcasts earlier, and there's so many parallels to that as well.
So we are hooking today's episode to this ruling and the fallout and the judgment and so forth, and I want to get to that. But let's go back a little to just the town itself, the plant itself, maybe the eve of this disaster. First off, did you come to an understanding of what role this plant held in this town? You hinted at the kind of racial makeup of the town, the economic picture in the town before this plant shows up. One thing I learned from the documentary is that this was literally built on a former plantation. Sort of tragic irony alert there. But it was also providing jobs, even as it was manufacturing materials that were being used in the war. So, how did people in town feel about this plant, both as an economic force, and then also were there rumblings about the safety standards at the plant ahead of the explosion?
Good question. Well, from my impression was everybody in the town was very happy to have Thiokol there when they came to town. And, there was no concern about, like we have today, about pollution or gentrification or anything like that. It was in a remote area away from residents, and they were making products that people could be proud of, to help the government, to help the military, even though we're talking about the least popular war in American history, but at that point, it wasn't that unpopular yet. And so there was a lot of pride, and these people were getting jobs in manufacturing, which, even just across the country, there weren't very many women in manufacturing. So that was a breakthrough. And it was a desegregated workforce. There were men and women working together. There were people of all races and ethnicities working together. So it was a really great thing. And, aside from the safety infractions, I think they paid pretty well, and they paid health insurance and overtime and everything. So people were very happy about it. It was just the safety factor that wasn't being followed. And so I did hear in my interviews, we interviewed over 35 people, survivors and first responders and relatives, a lot of those people in their 80s and 90s. So this is our last chance to hear their story. Wow. But, then after the explosion, obviously there was a different feeling about the company. But one of the things that I found to be most shocking about this whole story is that most of them went back to work.
Wow.
I think it was, for the most part, that was the best job they could get. So these people had to feed their families.
Not just but the best, but the only job I imagine they could get, aside from cleaning other people's houses or working in agriculture. There are not a lot of opportunities like that.
Yeah, there was a paper mill that employed a couple hundred people, and there, if you drive half an hour, you could work on some shrimp boats, and you could handle frozen shrimp, which is not very nice on your hands.
No.
This was the best thing they could do, and the plant actually asked their workers to come back and clean up a week later, and some of them did.
Wow.
And then they sent out a work notice a month later, and they said, if you don't show up to work, you'll be fired. So a lot of people did, and some people didn't. It seemed like it was about half and half, but they were soon back up to their original workforce. I think they stopped building trip flares, but they went on to build missiles for the Vietnam War after that.
And if we think about like the day that this happens, I mean, it does matter, the thing that you mentioned about the military not making clear the class of material people were handling, because when, it's about mid-morning, 10:40, 10:45 or so, this fire breaks out. Like you said, they'd happened before. And within 3 minutes, everyone's out of the building, right? Good fire safety protocol. People have evacuated. But because they don't know how super hazardous these materials are, they're not anticipating the kind of explosion that happens next. So they've followed the safety protocols. They've done everything they needed to do, but they're still surrounding the building when that fire spreads into the trip flares. And I mean, you even called the show The Day That Shook Georgia. Like, it shakes the ground because it's such a profound explosion.
You can feel it for 50 miles.
Yeah.
50 miles.
50 miles, that's right. People heard it and felt it,
Is it true that there was a Vietnam veteran who said that it was a sort of bigger explosion than anything he'd seen during the war?
Oh, yeah. We heard multiple accounts of people Vietnam veterans who said it was, the explosion and the aftermath was worse than anything they'd ever witnessed in war. Yeah.
What's the one thing that most history books all over the world have in common? That they're seriously lacking in the melanin department. Wondery's podcast, Black History for Real, introduces you to the most overlooked Black history makers you should already know. Follow Black History for Real on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Black History for Real early and ad-free now by joining Wondery Plus. Discover more to the story with Wondery's other top history podcasts.
Shalom, dear listeners. This is Daniil Hartman.
And I'm Yossi Klein Halevi.
Together we host the podcast For Heaven's Sake from the Shalom Hartman Institute.
These have been some of the most challenging days for me personally, for Israel, and for the Jewish people. And one of the ways in which I've gotten through this is that I've found solace and meaning through discussions with my dear friend and study partner, Daniil Hartman.
And I hope that listeners will join us as we continue to tackle the pressing questions facing the Jewish people here at For Heaven's Sake, which has become the #1 Judaism podcast.
Tune into For Heaven's Sake at shalomhartman.org/For Heaven's Sake, or wherever you get your podcasts.
There's one little detail in there which I think gets to the safety standards, and then, of course, that leads to the aftermath and the rulings and the court judgments and so forth. But this material that, as you mentioned, I just want to highlight this thing you'd already mentioned about the reclassification of the material. So the material that was being used for these trip flares had been classified as extremely dangerous, but is it that the plant had not been notified or just didn't know that it had been reclassified? I mean, is that really
good question. Down? So I think it was in 1968, a few years before, this stuff was classified as highly explosive, class 7. For some reason, and we don't know why, it was lower classified to class 2. Now, there's different theories about why that classification might have changed. I haven't been able to get, any definitive answer from, the Army. But a few months before the explosion, there was a new test done by the Army, and they determined that it was class 7. But that memo didn't get to Thiokol until 3 weeks after the explosion. And so, I don't necessarily believe that it was in the mail, when the explosion happened. And then that memo was found in an administrator's desk who at the time was in Tel Aviv, and we never found him. He was never called into the court case or anything. So, so point is, I guess there was a study, but the information didn't get to the Thiokol plant, which is why the Army was ultimately held accountable. But the judge didn't really order very much payment, in my opinion. Yeah.
Can we talk about the lawsuits and talk about how in the immediate aftermath, there's a couple things happening. These workers, they want to sue, they want to seek compensation from both Thiokol and the federal government. They're told, and correct me if I'm wrong, that like their workers' comp would have covered this or something like that they weren't able to sue because of workers' comp. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. And that's still the case today. The lawsuit itself divided families and tore apart the town in another way because, there was an ongoing debate. Like, should you take the workers' compensation payout or should you wait and try to file this lawsuit against the U.S. government?
But also, if you wait, it takes years.
Right. So it's a gamble. It turned out, I think, in a lot of people's cases, taking the workers' comp would have been better pay.
Even that didn't arrive for like a decade, right? The workers' comp? I mean, all of this really seems to happen very slowly.
Yeah. I mean, I think workers' comp can take a long time anyway. Yeah.
So there's 25 cases seeking damages are brought in federal tort claims in federal court, and it's like something like almost $720 million. That's what we're hooking this ruling. I mean, how can you just give a quick sketch of how this worked its way through the courts, and then how surprising the ruling was? And then you mentioned that you didn't think it was big enough.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of hearings and multiple judges. And again, I haven't been able to find any direct connection, but it is interesting that the Challenger explosion happened in 1986, and then within a year, this ruling was finished.
Interesting.
So some people did get compensated decently, I would say. People who lost limbs or were mortally wounded, couldn't work or whatever. But how do you put a price on 17 years?
Yeah.
And there are instances now where you can sue for time, but that didn't happen in this case.
Do you know, in terms of the payout that comes in the $720 million, there was a way, like a formula that they divvied out, like sort of who got what amount.
Yeah.
Were you able to talk to family members that said, yes, I got $5 million or something to, and do they even, I don't know, if their loved one is no longer alive because it takes so long, like, are we talking about the descendants of these victims as well?
Yeah, exactly. There were a lot of cases where the lawsuit started with the victim and then ended up going to the descendants. They asked for $770 million, but the government only paid $20 million in the end. So it was much less than what they had hoped, obviously. And the formula, which again, this story ties into 9/11 because it's the same formula that was used for the 9/11 victims, is basically how much money are you making right now? How many more years are you going to work until you would retire at age, 65 or whatever the number is? And then you multiply that out, and that's your payout. So on 9/11, a janitor might get $200,000 if they were mortally wounded, whereas a CEO at the top of one of the towers would get $20 million. But this case, the Thiokol case, along with some others in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, set the precedent for 9/11. And then 9/11 sort of changed that precedent again.
as we wrap up, I mentioned Jimmy Carter in the intro, and I want to get your take on the Jimmy Carter element of this story. So he was governor of Georgia at the time, obviously responded to this. We did an episode about 3 Mile Island, and in there we kind of pointed out that Jimmy Carter had, he has a science background. He worked on a nuclear submarine, and maybe that informed his response to 3 Mile Island a little bit. And I'm curious whether you felt like this was sort of similar. I mean, was he well positioned? Well, what do you make of his response in this moment? And did his science background sort of well position him to kind of really understand what was going on in this small town?
I think it probably did. So he came and showed up the night of the explosion, flew down there in a helicopter, and paid his condolences. And then he appointed a task force to help with cleaning up and compensation. And I haven't heard from him. We tried to get an interview with him. He doesn't do interviews anymore. I think he's 98 or something. We did screen the film at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, though, and that was a really great moment. And everyone there was excited to learn about this history and how it did involve Jimmy Carter.
One of the things that we love talking about on this show, in addition to Jimmy Carter and his Forrest Gump role in the 1970s, is how we memorialize these incidents. And so how does Woodbine or the surrounding area mark what happened there?
Well, for a long time, the people in Woodbine didn't want to talk about this. And so there was no interest in a memorial. It was more about how do we move on from this and how do we not talk about it. And then about 10 years ago, a daughter of one of the survivors who's in our film, Janie, she built a museum. And she started gathering photos and memorabilia or artifacts and interviews from people. And that little museum is what I stumbled upon, and it's the reason I made this film. So that museum is still there today. It's the Thiokol Memorial Project Museum. And you can go there and you can learn all about it. And Janie is very passionate. She'll give you an hour-and-a-half tour of the museum. And you can look through court documents and newspaper articles, and it's very fascinating. There's a highway marker. They're working on a bigger memorial, but the main campaign from Janie and the museum right now is to get the victims awarded with the Congressional Gold Medal. So they have a petition, and they think that it's a pretty reasonable petition to ask for these women to get that award. I think there's still a possibility they could.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave it there because, obviously there's a film for people to watch to get lots more about the story. It's a short film. It's 23 minutes. Is that right, Patrick?
21 minutes, yeah.
21. There you go.
Yeah.
And I mentioned it's from PBS, but where can anyone can watch it online, right?
Yeah, it's part of the Real South series on PBS. It's this season 9. So if you just go to pbs.org or the PBS app on your TV and search The Day That Shook Georgia, you should find it. Or if you search Real South season 9, you'll find it.
Great. And we will also put a link in our show notes and in our newsletter and all that stuff. But do go check out The Day That Shook Georgia. And yeah, Patrick Longstreth, congrats again. And thank you for telling the story.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.